Introduction. Explanation of the topic, migration from China to Africa. Migration is a fundamental human phenomenon that has taken place throughout history. It is driven by various factors, such as economic opportunities, social and political instability, and environmental changes. Over the past few decades, there has been a significant increase in the movement of people between China and Africa. This migration has been influenced by various factors, including economic opportunities, cultural exchange, and strategic geopolitical interests. The migration from China to Africa has a long history, dating back to ancient times. In the 15th century, Chinese explorers sailed to East Africa, and some Chinese merchants established trading posts in Africa. However, it was not until the 21st century that Chinese migration to Africa began to gain significant attention. One of the key factors driving Chinese migration to Africa is economic opportunities. Africa is a vast continent with abundant natural resources, such as oil, minerals, and agricultural land. Many Chinese entrepreneurs and investors are attracted to these resources and are keen to tap into the potential of the African market. They see Africa as an untapped market that offers tremendous opportunities for growth and expansion. Chinese companies are investing in various sectors, such as infrastructure development, mining, agriculture, and manufacturing. Another factor driving Chinese migration to Africa is cultural exchange. China and Africa have a long history of cultural and social interactions. Chinese culture has influenced African culture in various ways, such as through trade, religion, and language. For example, Chinese porcelain, silk, and tea were traded in Africa in ancient times, and some African societies adopted Chinese customs and practices. Chinese migration to Africa has led to the further exchange of culture and ideas between the two regions. Strategic geopolitical interests are also driving Chinese migration to Africa. China is seeking to expand its influence and presence in the global arena, and Africa is an important region for achieving this goal. China is investing in various African countries to secure access to strategic resources and to establish political and economic alliances with African governments. By doing so, China hopes to strengthen its position as a global power and to counterbalance the influence of other major powers, such as the United States. Chinese migration to Africa has also been influenced by political and social factors. China is facing a demographic crisis, with an aging population and a declining workforce. To address this issue, China has encouraged its citizens to migrate to other countries, including Africa, to seek employment and to start businesses. The Chinese government has also provided support and incentives for its citizens to migrate to Africa, such as through the provision of loans and other financial assistance. In addition, social and cultural factors are driving Chinese migration to Africa. Some Chinese citizens are attracted to the cultural diversity and richness of African societies and are eager to experience life in a different cultural context. Others are seeking to escape the high-pressure environment of Chinese society and are looking for a more relaxed and peaceful lifestyle in Africa. Despite the many factors driving Chinese migration to Africa, there are also challenges and issues that need to be addressed. One of the major challenges is the issue of cultural differences and misunderstandings. Chinese migrants may face difficulties in adapting to the cultural norms and practices of African societies, and vice versa. This can lead to conflicts and tensions between the two groups. Another challenge is the issue of language. Chinese migrants may face difficulties in communicating with local African communities due to language barriers. This can hinder their ability to integrate into local societies and to establish meaningful relationships with African people. Furthermore, Chinese migration to Africa has raised concerns about the impact on local economies and societies. Some critics argue that Chinese companies are exploiting African resources and labor and are not contributing to the development of local communities. There have also been reports of human rights abuses, such as the mistreatment of African workers by Chinese companies. To address these challenges, it is essential to promote greater cultural understanding and exchange between Chinese migrants and local African communities. This can be achieved through initiatives such as language training, cultural immersion programs, and community outreach activities. By promoting greater cultural understanding and appreciation, we can build stronger relationships between Chinese migrants and African communities and promote greater harmony and mutual respect. In addition, it is crucial to ensure that Chinese migration to Africa is conducted in a responsible and ethical manner. Chinese companies operating in Africa must adhere to high standards of labor and environmental practices, and they must respect the human rights and dignity of African workers. The Chinese government can play a significant role in promoting responsible migration by providing support and incentives for Chinese companies to invest in local communities and to promote sustainable development. Another critical aspect of promoting responsible migration is to address the issue of corruption. Corruption is a pervasive problem in many African countries and can undermine the legitimacy and effectiveness of government institutions. It can also create an unfavorable business environment for foreign investors, including Chinese companies. To address this issue, African governments must take strong action to combat corruption and to promote good governance and transparency. Furthermore, it is essential to promote greater inclusivity and diversity in the migration process. Chinese migrants must be encouraged to integrate into local communities and to contribute to local economies and societies. This can be achieved through initiatives such as vocational training, employment opportunities, and small business development programs. By promoting greater inclusivity and diversity, we can ensure that Chinese migration to Africa is a positive force for social and economic development. Finally, it is crucial to promote greater collaboration and partnership between China and Africa. China is a major investor in Africa, and it has the potential to play a significant role in promoting economic growth and development in the region. However, this can only be achieved through greater collaboration and partnership between China and African governments, businesses, and civil society organizations. By working together, we can create a more sustainable and mutually beneficial relationship between China and Africa that promotes economic growth, cultural exchange, and social development. Overview. The historical account provided in the paragraph describes the relationship between China and Africa, focusing on the migration of Chinese people to Africa over time. It begins with the story of Du Huan, who is believed to be the first Chinese person to visit Africa in the 8th century. This visit represents the earliest known contact between China and Africa. The paragraph goes on to highlight the consistent commercial relationship between Africa and China since the 7th century. During the Tang dynasty, Arab traders brought African slaves from East Africa to China, further strengthening the trade relations between the two regions. This trade relationship continued to grow over time, leading to increased cultural exchange and migration. The historical account provided in the paragraph shows that Chinese migration to Africa has a long and complex history that spans several centuries. This migration has been driven by various factors, including economic opportunities, cultural exchange, strategic geopolitical interests, and political and social factors. The historical account also highlights the important role that Arab traders played in facilitating the migration of Africans to China during the Tang dynasty. Chapter 1. Du Huan's visit to Africa. Du Huan's visit to Africa, which is believed to have occurred in the 8th century, is a significant event in the history of Chinese-African relations. According to historical accounts, Du Huan was a Chinese military officer who was sent by the Tang dynasty to explore and gather intelligence about the world beyond China's borders. Du Huan's travels took him across Central Asia and the Middle East, and eventually to Africa, where he is believed to have visited the region known as Nubia, located in modern-day Sudan. This region was an important trading center at the time, and it is believed that Du Huan was interested in establishing commercial relations with Nubia on behalf of the Tang dynasty. Du Huan's visit to Africa provides valuable insight into the early cultural exchange and diplomatic relations between China and Africa. It is important to note, however, that the extent of Du Huan's travels in Africa is not fully known, and some historians speculate that he may have actually traveled to other regions beyond Nubia. Despite the uncertainty surrounding the details of Du Huan's visit, his journey remains an important milestone in the history of Chinese-African relations. It is believed that Du Huan's visit laid the foundation for future trade and cultural exchange between China and Africa, which would continue to grow and develop over the centuries that followed. Today, Du Huan is remembered as an important figure in Chinese history, particularly for his travels and exploration beyond China's borders. His journey to Africa serves as a reminder of the importance of cross-cultural exchange and diplomacy in building strong and enduring relationships between nations and regions. Information about Du Huan and his visit to Africa. Du Huan was a Chinese military officer who is believed to have been the first Chinese person to visit Africa in the 8th century AD. He was sent by the Tang dynasty to explore and gather intelligence about the world beyond China's borders, and his travels took him across Central Asia and the Middle East, and eventually to Africa. Du Huan's journey to Africa is an important event in the history of Chinese-African relations. According to historical accounts, he visited the region known as Nubia, located in modern-day Sudan. This region was an important trading center at the time, and it is believed that Du Huan was interested in establishing commercial relations with Nubia on behalf of the Tang dynasty. During his visit to Nubia, Du Huan observed the local customs and practices, and his writings provide valuable insight into the early cultural exchange and diplomatic relations between China and Africa. He documented the local language and customs, and his writings serve as a valuable historical record of life in Nubia during the 8th century. While the details of Du Huan's visit to Africa are not fully known, it is clear that his journey laid the foundation for future trade and cultural exchange between China and Africa. Du Huan's visit to Africa represents an early example of cross-cultural exchange and diplomacy, and it demonstrates the importance of building strong and enduring relationships between nations and regions. Today, Du Huan is remembered as an important figure in Chinese history, particularly for his travels and exploration beyond China's borders. His journey to Africa serves as a reminder of the rich history of cultural exchange and diplomacy between China and Africa, and it highlights the importance of building strong relationships based on mutual respect and understanding. In addition to his visit to Nubia, Du Huan's travels also took him to other parts of Africa, although the extent of his travels on the continent is not fully known. Some historians speculate that Du Huan may have traveled to other regions beyond Nubia, such as the East African coast. The East African coast was an important trading center during this time period, with merchants from Arabia, Persia, India, and China traveling there to trade in goods such as ivory, gold, and slaves. It is believed that African slaves were brought to China during the Tang dynasty by Arab traders from East Africa, providing a historical connection between the two regions. Du Huan's visit to Africa also sheds light on the early cultural exchange between China and Africa. While in Nubia, he observed local customs and practices, and his writings provide valuable insights into the daily life of the people living in the region. He documented the local language, clothing, and religious practices, as well as the architecture and geography of the region. Du Huan's visit to Africa also marked the beginning of Chinese interest in the continent, which continued to grow over the centuries. Chinese explorers and traders continued to visit Africa, and by the 15th century, the Chinese Admiral Zheng He had undertaken several expeditions to East Africa, which strengthened diplomatic and commercial relations between the two regions. Today, the historical account of Du Huan's visit to Africa serves as a reminder of the rich and complex history of cultural exchange and diplomacy between China and Africa. The long history of interaction between the two regions has been characterized by trade, migration, cultural exchange, and diplomatic relations. In recent years, China's involvement in Africa has increased significantly, with Chinese companies investing heavily in infrastructure projects such as railways, ports, and telecommunications. This has led to concerns about the potential impact of Chinese investment on the economies and political stability of African countries. However, the historical account of Du Huan's visit to Africa provides an important context for understanding the current relationship between China and Africa. It demonstrates that the two regions have a long history of interaction, and that the current relationship is built on a foundation of mutual interest and cooperation. The migration from China to Africa is a complex and multifaceted phenomenon that has evolved over centuries. While Du Huan's visit to Africa in the 8th century is often cited as the earliest evidence of Chinese migration to the continent, it is important to note that Chinese migrants have been traveling to Africa for various reasons throughout history. One of the main reasons for Chinese migration to Africa has been trade. As mentioned earlier, Chinese merchants and traders have been visiting Africa for centuries, with trade in goods such as ivory, gold, and spices being particularly important. In recent decades, Chinese investment in Africa has also been a major driver of migration, with Chinese companies sending workers to the continent to work on infrastructure projects and other ventures. Another reason for Chinese migration to Africa is education. Many Chinese students travel to Africa to study, particularly in fields such as medicine and engineering. This has led to the establishment of Chinese language schools and other educational institutions in Africa, as well as increased cultural exchange between the two regions. Chinese migration to Africa has also been driven by political factors. During the Cold War, China supported various African liberation movements, and Chinese migrants played an important role in providing military and other forms of assistance to these movements. In more recent years, China's growing global influence has led to increased migration to Africa by Chinese nationals seeking new opportunities and experiences. The migration from China to Africa has not been without its challenges, however. Chinese migrants have faced discrimination and hostility in some African countries, particularly in instances where their presence is seen as threatening local jobs and economic opportunities. Chinese companies operating in Africa have also been accused of engaging in exploitative labor practices and contributing to environmental degradation. In response to these challenges, efforts have been made to promote greater understanding and cooperation between China and Africa. The Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, established in 2000, provides a platform for high-level dialogue and cooperation between the two regions, with a focus on areas such as trade, investment, and infrastructure development. The Chinese government has also implemented policies aimed at promoting greater cultural exchange and mutual understanding between China and Africa. Significance of Du Huan's visit in the context of Chinese-African relations. Du Huan's visit to Africa in the 8th century holds significant historical and cultural significance in the context of Chinese-African relations. As the first recorded Chinese visitor to Africa, Du Huan's account of his travels provides a valuable insight into the early history of Chinese-African contact. Du Huan's visit is significant because it reveals the early connections between China and Africa, which have since developed into a long-standing and multifaceted relationship. Du Huan's account of his travels mentions the trade and commercial connections that existed between China and Africa at the time, highlighting the importance of trade in driving Chinese-African relations even in the early days. Moreover, Du Huan's visit paved the way for subsequent Chinese visits to Africa, contributing to the growth and deepening of Chinese-African relations over the centuries. The trade connections established during Du Huan's time have continued to grow and evolve over the years, with trade remaining a key driver of Chinese-African relations today. Furthermore, Du Huan's visit also reveals the cultural connections that existed between China and Africa, even in the early days. Du Huan noted the presence of African slaves in China, brought by Arab traders from East Africa, highlighting the early cultural exchange that took place between the two regions. Today, cultural exchange between China and Africa remains an important aspect of their relations, with increasing numbers of Chinese students studying in Africa and African students studying in China. Du Huan's visit also laid the foundation for subsequent Chinese explorers and travelers who came to Africa over the years. These include the famous Chinese explorer Zheng He, who made multiple voyages to East Africa during the 15th century. Zheng He's visits further deepened Chinese-African relations, with his voyages contributing to the spread of Chinese culture and ideas to East Africa. Du Huan's visit to Africa not only provided valuable insights into early Chinese-African relations but also contributed to a greater understanding of the continent itself. His travels through Africa allowed him to document the geography, customs, and people he encountered, providing a unique perspective that was not available to Chinese scholars at the time. Du Huan's account of his travels provides important information on the trade routes and commercial connections that existed between China and Africa during the Tang dynasty. He described how Arab traders from East Africa brought slaves and ivory to China, highlighting the importance of these goods in driving trade between the two regions. His account also reveals the presence of Chinese traders in Africa, who were involved in the exchange of goods such as silk and ceramics. Furthermore, Du Huan's visit allowed him to document the customs and traditions of the African people he encountered. He wrote about the Nubian people he met, noting their dress, language, and customs. He also documented the geography of the region, describing the Nile River and its importance to the local people. His observations provided valuable insights into the diverse cultures and traditions of Africa, contributing to a greater understanding of the continent among Chinese scholars and the wider world. Du Huan's visit also demonstrates the importance of travel and exploration in expanding knowledge and understanding of other cultures. His travels allowed him to document the customs, traditions, and geography of a region that was previously unknown to the Chinese. His account served as a valuable resource for scholars and explorers who came after him, providing a framework for subsequent exploration and travel to Africa. In addition to the historical and cultural significance of Du Huan's visit, it also has implications for modern Chinese-African relations. The early connections established through trade and cultural exchange have continued to grow and evolve, with China emerging as a major player in African development and investment. Today, China is Africa's largest trading partner and a major investor in infrastructure projects across the continent. Furthermore, cultural exchange between China and Africa remains an important aspect of their relations, with increasing numbers of Chinese students studying in Africa and African students studying in China. China has also initiated cultural exchange programs aimed at promoting greater understanding and appreciation of African culture in China. The historical significance of Du Huan's visit to Africa is further emphasized by the fact that it is one of the earliest recorded accounts of Chinese exploration and travel outside of Asia. It predates the famous voyages of Admiral Zheng He, who sailed to Africa and other parts of the world during the Ming dynasty in the 15th century. Du Huan's account of his travels also sheds light on the historical context of the Tang dynasty, which was a time of great cultural and commercial exchange between China and the outside world. This period saw the development of the Silk Road, which was a vast network of trade routes connecting China to the Mediterranean region, and which facilitated the exchange of goods and ideas between China and other parts of the world. Du Huan's visit to Africa, therefore, can be seen as part of this broader trend of exploration and exchange, which helped to establish China as a global power and to promote cultural and commercial connections between different regions of the world. Furthermore, Du Huan's account of his travels also provides valuable insights into the social and economic structures of the societies he encountered. He describes the presence of kings and chieftains, as well as the use of slave labor in some regions, highlighting the diversity and complexity of the social systems that existed in Africa at the time. This information has been valuable not only to historians and scholars but also to policymakers and development practitioners working in Africa today. By understanding the historical context and social structures of different regions, it is possible to develop more effective strategies for promoting development and social progress in contemporary contexts. Moreover, Du Huan's visit to Africa can be seen as part of a broader trend of cross-cultural exchange and dialogue that has characterized human history for millennia. Throughout history, people have traveled and explored, seeking new knowledge and experiences, and exchanging ideas and goods with other cultures. In the context of modern globalization, this trend has become even more pronounced, with people, goods, and ideas flowing across borders and connecting people from all corners of the world. In this sense, Du Huan's visit to Africa can be seen as part of a long and ongoing process of globalization and cross-cultural exchange that continues to shape our world today. Finally, Du Huan's visit to Africa serves as a reminder of the importance of understanding and appreciating the diversity of human cultures and experiences. By documenting the customs, traditions, and geography of the African regions he visited, Du Huan helped to promote greater understanding and appreciation of the continent among the Chinese and the wider world. In an increasingly globalized and interconnected world, this message is more important than ever. By seeking out and valuing the diverse perspectives and experiences of others, we can develop a more nuanced and compassionate understanding of the world around us, and work towards a more just and equitable future for all. Du Huan's visit to Africa is also significant in the context of the development of global trade and commerce. At the time of his visit, China was already a major economic power, and the Tang dynasty was renowned for its economic and cultural prosperity. Du Huan's accounts of the trade and commerce he witnessed in Africa demonstrate the importance of trade in the development of both African and Chinese societies. His descriptions of the different goods traded, including gold, ivory, and slaves, highlight the economic value of Africa to China and other parts of the world. Moreover, Du Huan's visit to Africa was part of a broader trend of exploration and trade that helped to establish the Silk Road as a major artery of global trade and commerce. The Silk Road connected China to Europe and the Middle East, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies between different regions of the world. Today, as the world continues to become more interconnected through trade and commerce, the lessons of Du Huan's visit to Africa remain relevant. As nations around the world seek to develop their economies and promote prosperity for their citizens, understanding the importance of trade and commerce, and the role of cultural exchange in promoting economic growth, remains essential. Moreover, Du Huan's visit to Africa also highlights the importance of diplomacy and cultural exchange in building strong relationships between different nations and cultures. The Tang dynasty was known for its diplomatic prowess, and its rulers sought to build positive relationships with neighboring nations through cultural exchange and trade. Du Huan's visit to Africa can be seen as part of this broader diplomatic effort, helping to establish positive relations between China and Africa, and paving the way for future cultural and commercial exchange between the two regions. Chapter 2. Chinese-African Commercial Relationship. The commercial relationship between China and Africa has a long and complex history that stretches back over a millennium. As the paragraph mentioned, the commercial relationship between Africans and Chinese dates back to the 7th century, and has continued to evolve and expand over time. One of the most significant periods in this relationship was during the Tang dynasty, when Arab traders brought African slaves from East Africa to China. This trade helped to establish a link between Africa and China, and paved the way for future trade and commerce between the two regions. Over the centuries, the trade relationship between Africa and China has taken many forms, including the exchange of precious metals, ivory, and other goods. During the Ming dynasty, 1368 to 1644, for example, the Chinese began to import large quantities of ivory from Africa, which was used to produce a wide range of luxury goods. In recent decades, however, the nature of the commercial relationship between China and Africa has changed dramatically. China's rapid economic growth and its need for resources has led to a significant increase in Chinese investment in Africa, particularly in the extractive industries such as oil, gas, and minerals. This investment has had a significant impact on the economies of many African countries, providing much needed capital and infrastructure for development. However, it has also been the subject of controversy, with some critics accusing China of exploiting African resources and labor for its own benefit. Despite these challenges, however, the commercial relationship between China and Africa continues to evolve and expand. Today, China is one of Africa's largest trading partners, and the two regions engage in a wide range of economic activities, from infrastructure development to the exchange of consumer goods. One of the most significant recent developments in this relationship has been the growth of Chinese investment in African infrastructure. China has financed a number of large-scale infrastructure projects in Africa, including ports, highways, and railways, which have helped to connect different regions of the continent and stimulate economic growth. Moreover, China has also become a major investor in renewable energy projects in Africa, providing capital and expertise for the development of solar and wind power. This investment is helping to address Africa's energy needs and reduce its reliance on fossil fuels, which is seen as a key priority for sustainable development. Another important aspect of the Chinese-African commercial relationship is the exchange of goods and services. China is a major exporter of manufactured goods, electronics, and consumer products, and Africa is a large market for these goods. Conversely, African countries export raw materials, such as oil, gas, minerals, and agricultural products, to China, which are essential to fuel China's industrial and economic growth. This trade relationship has led to the growth of China's presence in Africa, with Chinese companies investing heavily in manufacturing, construction, and other industries. This has resulted in the creation of jobs and economic opportunities for Africans, as well as the transfer of technology and knowledge. However, there are also concerns about the impact of Chinese companies on African industries and businesses. Some critics argue that Chinese companies engage in unfair competition practices, such as dumping, which harms local businesses and industries. Others point to the fact that many Chinese companies operating in Africa rely on imported Chinese labor, rather than hiring local workers, which can exacerbate existing unemployment and inequality. In addition to economic ties, there are also cultural and political dimensions to the Chinese-African relationship. China has a long history of engagement with Africa, dating back to the ancient trade routes that linked the two regions. This shared history has helped to establish a cultural connection between the two regions, with China being seen as a valuable partner and ally in the African continent. Politically, China has also sought to deepen its ties with Africa in recent years, through the establishment of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC, in 2000. This forum has become a major platform for diplomatic engagement and dialogue between China and African countries, and has led to the signing of a number of cooperation agreements and partnerships. China has also been a significant player in Africa's development, providing aid and financing for a wide range of initiatives, from health and education to infrastructure and energy. This has helped to strengthen China's influence in the region, and has positioned China as a key partner for African countries seeking to achieve their development goals. However, there are also concerns about China's growing influence in Africa, particularly with regards to governance and human rights. Critics argue that China's engagement with Africa is driven by its own strategic interests, rather than a genuine concern for Africa's development, and that China's emphasis on non-interference in domestic affairs can sometimes undermine democratic governance and human rights. Moreover, there are also concerns about the environmental impact of Chinese investment in Africa, particularly in the extractive industries. China's focus on resource extraction has led to significant environmental degradation, including deforestation, pollution, and the displacement of local communities. Overview of the commercial relationship between China and Africa since the 7th century. The commercial relationship between China and Africa has a long history that can be traced back to the 7th century. Since then, the two regions have maintained a consistent trade relationship that has evolved over time and has been influenced by various factors such as politics, economics, and culture. During the Tang dynasty, 618 to 907 AD, China's trade with Africa was primarily through the Silk Road, which connected China with the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Arab traders acted as intermediaries between China and Africa, bringing African goods such as ivory, gold, and slaves to the Chinese markets. In exchange, they took silk, porcelain, and other Chinese goods to Africa. This trade relationship was largely confined to the coastal areas of East Africa, where Arab traders had established trading posts and settlements. The trade relationship between China and Africa continued to flourish during the Song dynasty, 960-1279 AD. However, This time, Chinese merchants started to venture into Africa, bypassing the Arab intermediaries. They established trade networks and communities in various parts of Africa, including the Swahili coast, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean. These Chinese merchants traded a wide range of goods, including silk, porcelain, tea, and weapons, for African goods such as ivory, gold, and exotic animals. In the 15th century, the Chinese explorer Zheng He led several expeditions to East Africa, which further strengthened the trade relationship between China and Africa. Zheng He's expeditions were aimed at exploring new trade routes and establishing diplomatic ties with foreign powers. His voyages brought back a wealth of knowledge about Africa, including its geography, culture, and people. The trade relationship between China and Africa declined during the Ming Dynasty, 1368 to 1644 AD, due to political instability and the growing influence of the Portuguese and Dutch in East Africa. However, trade between the two regions resumed during the Qing Dynasty, 1644 to 1912 AD. Chinese traders once again started to venture into Africa, establishing trade networks and communities in various parts of the continent. The 19th century saw a significant increase in trade between China and Africa, with the latter becoming an important source of raw materials for China's rapidly growing economy. In the early 20th century, China's demand for African resources increased further due to the country's industrialization efforts. African countries, on the other hand, saw China as an important trading partner and a potential ally in their struggle for independence from colonial powers. In recent years, China's economic ties with Africa have grown significantly, with China becoming Africa's largest trading partner. China's investments in Africa have focused on infrastructure projects, such as building roads, railways, and ports, as well as investments in natural resources such as oil, minerals, and timber. China's economic presence in Africa has been both praised and criticized, with some arguing that it has helped to drive economic growth and development in the region, while others point to concerns about labor rights, environmental impact, and debt sustainability. Types of goods and commodities traded between the two regions. Since the 7th century, there has been a consistent commercial relationship between Africa and China, with various goods and commodities being traded between the two regions. Over the centuries, the types of goods traded have evolved and changed based on economic, political, and cultural factors. One of the most notable goods traded between China and Africa was silk. The Silk Road, an ancient network of trade routes that connected China to the Mediterranean, allowed for the exchange of silk, tea, porcelain, and other luxury goods. Arab traders brought silk to Africa from China, and it quickly became a valuable commodity, particularly in the eastern and southern regions of the continent. In addition to silk, Chinese traders brought various other goods to Africa, including ceramics, iron tools, and luxury items like jade and gold. Chinese merchants were also interested in acquiring African goods, particularly ivory, rhinoceros horn, and tortoise shell. These products were highly valued in China, where they were used for decorative and medicinal purposes. Over time, the types of goods traded between China and Africa expanded to include agricultural products, such as tea and sugar, and raw materials like copper, tin, and timber. In the modern era, Chinese companies have become major investors in Africa's natural resource sector, particularly in oil, gas, and minerals. In recent years, the trade relationship between China and Africa has shifted towards manufactured goods, with China exporting a wide range of products to African countries. Chinese companies have established manufacturing plants in Africa, producing goods like textiles, electronics, and automobiles. In addition to trade in goods, China and Africa also engage in trade in services, particularly in the areas of construction and infrastructure development. Chinese firms have been involved in building major infrastructure projects in Africa, including ports, highways, railways, and power plants. The types of goods and commodities traded between China and Africa have changed over time, reflecting shifts in economic and political priorities. However, the commercial relationship between the two regions remains strong, with China continuing to be a major trading partner and investor in Africa. Factors that contributed to the development and maintenance of this relationship. Several factors have contributed to the development and maintenance of the commercial relationship between China and Africa over the centuries. These factors include economic, political, and cultural factors, as well as technological advances and the role of intermediaries. One of the most significant factors contributing to the development of the relationship was the geographic proximity of East Africa to China. This proximity made it relatively easy for traders from both regions to engage in commercial activities. Moreover, the Silk Road, which connected China to the Mediterranean and beyond, facilitated trade and cultural exchange between China and Africa. Another important factor was the role of intermediaries, particularly Arab traders who acted as middlemen between China and East Africa. Arab traders played a critical role in transporting goods between the two regions, as well as facilitating communication and cultural exchange. Cultural factors also played a role in the development of the relationship. The Chinese and African cultures share a long history of trade and cultural exchange, which has contributed to a mutual understanding and respect between the two regions. Additionally, both cultures have a tradition of valuing interpersonal relationships and the building of trust, which has helped to maintain the commercial relationship over time. Technological advances have also played a significant role in the development of the relationship. The development of maritime technology, such as ships capable of long-distance voyages, made it easier for Chinese traders to travel to Africa and for African traders to travel to China. Similarly, advances in communication technology, such as the telegraph and later the Internet, have made it easier for traders from both regions to communicate and conduct business. Political factors have also played a role in the development and maintenance of the relationship. The political stability of both China and Africa has been important in facilitating trade and investment. Additionally, political leaders from both regions have sought to strengthen the relationship through diplomatic initiatives and trade agreements. Finally, economic factors have played a significant role in the development and maintenance of the relationship. Both China and Africa have economies that complement each other, with China supplying manufactured goods and technology, and Africa providing natural resources and agricultural products. Additionally, the growing middle class in Africa has created a growing market for Chinese consumer goods. The commercial relationship between China and Africa has not been without its challenges, however. One of the major criticisms of the relationship is the perceived unequal distribution of benefits. Some have accused China of engaging in neocolonialism, using its economic power to extract resources from African countries without providing commensurate benefits. There have also been concerns about the impact of Chinese investment on African economies, particularly in relation to debt sustainability. Some African countries have taken on large amounts of debt to fund infrastructure projects, many of which have been contracted to Chinese companies. This has led to concerns about the long-term financial sustainability of these projects and the potential for African countries to become over-reliant on Chinese investment. Furthermore, there have been concerns about the impact of Chinese investment on local industries and employment. Some critics argue that Chinese investment in African countries has led to the displacement of local industries and the exploitation of African labor. Despite these challenges, the commercial relationship between China and Africa continues to grow. In recent years, China has sought to strengthen its ties with Africa through the implementation of the Belt and Road Initiative, a massive infrastructure project aimed at improving connectivity between China and the rest of the world. This initiative has included significant investment in African countries, particularly in the areas of transportation and energy infrastructure. Moreover, China has also sought to address some of the concerns around the relationship. For example, in 2018, China pledged to provide $60 billion in financing for African countries, including $15 billion in grants and interest-free loans, as part of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. Chapter 3. Arab Traders and African Slaves in China. During the Tang dynasty in China, Arab traders played a significant role in facilitating trade between Africa and China. One notable aspect of this trade was the transportation of African slaves from East Africa to China. This practice is believed to have started during the 7th century, and continued into the 9th century. The Arab traders who brought African slaves to China did so primarily to serve as household servants, laborers, and soldiers. These slaves were considered a luxury item, and were often kept by wealthy Chinese families or used by the imperial court. The arrival of African slaves in China had a significant impact on Chinese society. While it is difficult to estimate the exact number of African slaves who were brought to China, it is believed to have been a relatively small number compared to other forms of labor in China at the time. Nonetheless, the presence of African slaves in China challenged traditional Chinese notions of racial identity and hierarchy. The arrival of African slaves also had an impact on Chinese art and culture. African slaves were often depicted in Chinese art during the Tang dynasty, and their influence can be seen in the depiction of foreign figures in Chinese art throughout history. Furthermore, African slaves brought with them new forms of music, dance, and other cultural practices that would go on to influence Chinese culture. Despite the significant impact of African slaves on Chinese society and culture, the practice of bringing African slaves to China was relatively short-lived. By the 9th century, the demand for African slaves in China had declined, and the practice gradually came to an end. Today, the legacy of African slaves in China can be seen in the small population of people of African descent who still live in China, particularly in the southern city of Guangzhou. These individuals are often referred to as Black Chinese and face unique challenges related to racial identity and discrimination. The arrival of African slaves in China was just one aspect of the larger commercial relationship between China and Africa. The trade between the two regions was driven by a variety of factors, including the desire for luxury goods, the need for raw materials, and the exchange of knowledge and ideas. One of the most important commodities traded between China and Africa was ivory. Chinese demand for ivory dates back to ancient times, and African elephants were hunted for their ivory tusks in large numbers to meet this demand. Ivory was highly valued in China for its beauty and rarity, and it was used to create a wide range of luxury goods, including figurines, jewelry, and decorative items. Another important commodity traded between China and Africa was silk. Silk was highly prized in Africa for its beauty and durability, and it was used to create a wide range of garments and textiles. In return, African traders brought goods such as gold, spices, and exotic animals to China. Chinese-African trade was not limited to goods and commodities. Chinese traders also brought knowledge and ideas to Africa, particularly in the areas of agriculture and medicine. For example, Chinese merchants introduced rice cultivation to East Africa, which became an important crop for the region. Chinese medicine also had a significant impact on traditional African medicine, with Chinese herbs and practices being adopted by African healers. The Chinese-African commercial relationship was also influenced by political factors. During the Tang dynasty, for example, China maintained diplomatic relations with a number of African states, including Nubia, modern-day Sudan, and Ethiopia. These diplomatic relationships helped to facilitate trade and cultural exchange between the two regions. Overall, the commercial relationship between China and Africa has a long and complex history. The arrival of African slaves in China during the Tang dynasty was just one aspect of this relationship, which was driven by a variety of factors including the desire for luxury goods, the need for raw materials, and the exchange of knowledge and ideas. Despite its ups and downs, the relationship between China and Africa remains important today, with China playing a significant role in African development and trade. Overview of the Tang dynasty in China. The Tang dynasty was a golden age in Chinese history that lasted from 618 to 907 AD. It was a time of great prosperity, cultural and artistic achievements, and military expansion. The Tang dynasty is considered one of the most important periods in Chinese history, with its influence being felt in many areas, including literature, religion, politics, and international relations. The Tang dynasty was founded by Li Yuan, who took the throne after overthrowing the Sui dynasty. Li Yuan established a strong central government that was based on the principles of Confucianism. Under his leadership, the Tang dynasty began to flourish, with a focus on economic growth and the expansion of the empire through military conquests. One of the most significant achievements of the Tang dynasty was the establishment of the Grand Canal, a system of waterways that linked northern and southern China. This allowed for the transportation of goods and people across the empire, facilitating economic growth and cultural exchange. The Tang dynasty was also known for its cultural achievements. Literature and poetry flourished during this time, with many famous poets and writers, such as Li Bai and Du Fu, producing works that are still celebrated today. Buddhism and Taoism were also important influences on Tang culture, with many temples and religious institutions being built during this time. In terms of international relations, the Tang dynasty maintained diplomatic relations with many neighboring states, including Korea, Japan, and Tibet. The Tang dynasty also had extensive trade relations with Central Asia and the Middle East, with the Silk Road serving as an important route for trade and cultural exchange. Despite its many achievements, the Tang dynasty began to decline in the late 8th century due to a combination of factors, including political corruption, economic instability, and military defeats. The dynasty finally came to an end in 907 AD, with the collapse of central authority leading to a period of disunity and chaos in China. Despite its eventual decline, the Tang dynasty remains an important period in Chinese history, with its cultural, economic, and political legacy being felt to this day. One of the most notable aspects of the Tang dynasty was its military prowess and expansion. Under the leadership of Tang Taizong, the second emperor of the dynasty, the Tang army conquered many neighboring states and expanded the empire to its greatest extent. The Tang dynasty's military campaigns were not only aimed at expanding the empire, but also at securing the Silk Road trade route and protecting China from foreign invasions. One of the most significant military achievements of the Tang dynasty was the defeat of the Goguryeo kingdom in Korea, which allowed the Tang to establish a protectorate over the Korean peninsula. The Tang dynasty was also known for its advanced technology and innovations. During this time, many inventions were made in fields such as agriculture, medicine, and transportation. Some notable inventions of the Tang dynasty include gunpowder, the printing press, and the use of paper money. The Tang dynasty also saw the rise of the imperial examination system, which was used to select government officials based on their knowledge of Confucian classics. This system allowed for a merit-based system of government and helped to ensure that officials were selected based on their abilities rather than their family background or wealth. In terms of religion, the Tang dynasty saw the spread of Buddhism throughout China. Many famous Buddhist temples were built during this time, such as the famous giant Wild Goose Pagoda in Xi'an. Buddhism played an important role in Tang culture and was often combined with traditional Chinese beliefs and practices. Role of Arab traders in the transportation of African slaves from East Africa to China. During the Tang dynasty in China, African slaves were brought to China from East Africa by Arab traders. The role of Arab traders in the transportation of African slaves to China was significant and played a crucial role in the slave trade between Africa and China. The Arab traders who brought African slaves to China were primarily from the Middle East, particularly from present-day Iraq and Iran. They had established trade routes with East Africa, which allowed them to transport goods such as ivory, gold, and slaves across the Indian Ocean. The African slaves that were transported to China were primarily captured from regions along the East African coast, including modern-day Tanzania, Kenya, and Mozambique. They were usually captured by African slave traders and then sold to Arab traders who would transport them to the Middle East and China. The slaves were transported to China primarily to work in the households of the wealthy and to perform labor-intensive tasks. They were often used as domestic servants, laborers, and soldiers. Some were even used in the construction of the famous Grand Canal, which connected the Yellow River to the Yangtze River and facilitated trade and transportation within China. The Arab traders who transported African slaves to China played a crucial role in facilitating the slave trade between Africa and China. They were responsible for the transportation of the slaves across the Indian Ocean, and they also played a key role in negotiating the sale and purchase of slaves with African slave traders. The role of Arab traders in the transportation of African slaves to China had a significant impact on the development of Chinese society and culture. The presence of African slaves in China introduced new cultural influences and contributed to the development of Chinese art, music, and cuisine. However, the slave trade itself was a significant human rights violation and had a devastating impact on the lives of millions of African men, women, and children who were captured and sold into slavery. The legacy of the slave trade between Africa and China is a reminder of the dark history of the exploitation of vulnerable populations for economic gain. The Tang dynasty in China was a prosperous era characterized by economic growth, cultural flourishing, and political stability. During this time, the dynasty's central government exercised strong control over the country's territory and trade routes, leading to increased contact with foreign lands. One significant development during the Tang dynasty was the growth of maritime trade, which expanded China's commercial ties with foreign lands, including East Africa. Arab traders played a crucial role in facilitating this trade, acting as intermediaries between China and East Africa. Arab traders had a long history of trading in East Africa, with some accounts suggesting that they had been visiting the region since the 1st century AD. By the time of the Tang dynasty, they had established regular trade routes between the Swahili coast and China, bringing goods such as ivory, tortoise shell, rhinoceros horn, and slaves to Chinese markets. It is believed that Arab traders played a significant role in transporting African slaves from East Africa to China during the Tang dynasty. This trade was driven by China's demand for exotic goods, including African slaves, who were valued for their labor and skills. While the exact number of African slaves who were brought to China during this time is not known, it is clear that the trade was significant and played a role in shaping Chinese society. The Arab traders who facilitated this trade were typically from the Arabian Peninsula or the Persian Gulf, and they used their extensive knowledge of maritime trade routes to navigate the waters between East Africa and China. They would purchase African slaves in ports along the Swahili coast and transport them to China, where they would be sold in the marketplaces of cities such as Guangzhou and Quanzhou. The African slaves who were brought to China during this time were mostly from East Africa, particularly from regions such as modern-day Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique. They were typically men and women who were captured during raids or wars and sold into slavery. Some of these slaves were skilled artisans, such as metal workers or weavers, and their expertise was highly valued in Chinese society. Despite the significant role that Arab traders played in facilitating the trade of African slaves to China during the Tang dynasty, it is worth noting that they were not the only actors involved in this trade. Chinese traders and merchants were also involved, as were African intermediaries who helped to transport the slaves from their places of capture to the ports where they would be sold. Treatment and experiences of African slaves in China. The historical accounts of African slaves in China are limited, and the treatment and experiences of these slaves are not well documented. However, it is known that during the Tang dynasty, African slaves were brought to China from East Africa by Arab traders. The slaves were primarily used for labor in various industries, including agriculture, mining, and as domestic servants. It is unclear how the African slaves were treated by their Chinese masters. Some historical accounts suggest that the treatment of slaves in China was less harsh compared to other parts of the world. Chinese society valued the concept of filial piety, which meant showing respect and care for one's elders and ancestors. This principle extended to the treatment of slaves, who were considered part of the family unit and were expected to be treated with respect. However, it is also known that slaves in China had limited rights and were subjected to various forms of abuse. They were considered the property of their masters and had no legal standing. They could be bought and sold at will and were often subjected to physical punishment for disobedience or perceived wrongdoing. Slaves in China were also subject to social and economic discrimination, as they were not considered equal members of society. Despite the lack of information about the experiences of African slaves in China, it is clear that their presence in the country had a significant impact on Chinese society. The introduction of African slaves brought new cultural and ethnic diversity to China and contributed to the development of new cultural practices and traditions. In addition, the presence of African slaves in China challenged the traditional Confucian social order, which emphasized social hierarchy and the importance of maintaining social status. The inclusion of non-Chinese slaves disrupted this order, and the treatment of slaves in China became a subject of debate and discussion among Chinese intellectuals. During the Tang dynasty, African slaves were brought to China by Arab traders from East Africa. The treatment and experiences of these slaves in China were largely dependent on their social status, occupation, and location. The Tang dynasty was a period of significant cultural and economic exchange, and the African slaves played an important role in this exchange. The African slaves were initially brought to China to serve as military personnel and palace servants. They were considered a luxury item and were used to impress and entertain guests. The slaves were often given exotic names, and their African origins were used to enhance their appeal. Many of these slaves were skilled in various crafts, such as metalworking, weaving, and carpentry, and were valued for their expertise. Despite their high social status, the African slaves were still considered property and were subject to the laws of their owners. They were not allowed to marry, and their offspring were considered the property of their owners. However, some slaves were able to achieve a degree of social mobility and even rise to positions of power and influence. The experiences of African slaves in China varied widely depending on their occupation and location. Some slaves were treated with kindness and were able to integrate into Chinese society. Others were subjected to harsh treatment and abuse, and many died due to the harsh conditions they endured. Slaves who were employed in the military often fared better than those who worked in the palace. Military slaves were able to earn their freedom by serving their masters in battle and could even rise to positions of power within the military. Palace slaves, on the other hand, were subject to the whims of their owners and were often mistreated and abused. Despite their difficult circumstances, the African slaves made significant contributions to Chinese society during the Tang dynasty. They brought with them a rich cultural heritage that included music, dance, and other forms of art. They also introduced new foods and spices to the Chinese, which helped to broaden their culinary horizons. In addition to their cultural contributions, the African slaves played an important role in the economic development of China. Many slaves were skilled craftsmen and were able to contribute to the construction of important buildings and structures. They were also involved in trade and commerce and helped to facilitate the exchange of goods between China and Africa. The Tang dynasty was a period of significant cultural and economic exchange between China and Africa. The African slaves who were brought to China played an important role in this exchange and helped to shape the cultural and economic landscape of China. Despite their difficult circumstances, the African slaves made significant contributions to Chinese society and are an important part of China's rich cultural heritage. Chapter 4. Contemporary Chinese Migration to Africa. Contemporary Chinese migration to Africa has become a significant topic of discussion in recent years, as China's presence in Africa continues to grow. The number of Chinese migrants to Africa has increased substantially over the past few decades, with many coming to the continent to work in various industries and sectors. One of the main drivers of Chinese migration to Africa has been the Chinese government's going out policy, which was implemented in the early 2000s. This policy aimed to encourage Chinese businesses to invest and expand overseas, including in Africa. As a result, Chinese companies have become major players in African economies, particularly in sectors such as construction, mining, and telecommunications. Chinese migrants to Africa are not limited to skilled professionals or entrepreneurs. There are also a significant number of unskilled and semi-skilled Chinese workers who have migrated to Africa in search of employment opportunities. Many of these workers are employed in construction projects, where they are often involved in the building of infrastructure such as roads, bridges, and buildings. The migration of Chinese workers to Africa has not been without controversy, however. There have been reports of poor working conditions, low pay, and other labor-related issues faced by Chinese workers in Africa. Additionally, some African countries have raised concerns about the impact of Chinese migration on local job markets and economies. Another area of concern related to Chinese migration to Africa is the issue of illegal immigration. Some Chinese migrants have entered African countries illegally, without proper documentation or work permits. This has led to tensions between Chinese migrants and local authorities, and has prompted some countries to crack down on illegal immigration. Despite these challenges, Chinese migration to Africa is expected to continue to grow in the coming years. The Chinese government's focus on expanding its presence in Africa, combined with Africa's rapidly growing population and economies, make the continent an attractive destination for Chinese migrants. In addition to labor migration, contemporary Chinese migration to Africa also includes entrepreneurs and business people looking to invest and establish business ventures in various African countries. China has emerged as Africa's largest trading partner and investor in recent years, with investments ranging from infrastructure projects, mining operations, to real estate developments. The influx of Chinese migrants has also been accompanied by cultural exchange and collaboration in areas such as education, tourism, and sports. However, the rapid influx of Chinese migrants into Africa has also raised concerns about the impact on local communities and economies. Some African countries have expressed concern about Chinese companies bringing in their own workers and not hiring local labor, leading to a lack of job opportunities for the local population. There have also been reports of Chinese businesses engaging in illegal activities, such as wildlife trafficking and environmental degradation. Furthermore, the relationship between China and Africa has been criticized by some for its neocolonialist overtones, with China using its economic and political influence to extract resources from Africa and leaving behind little local benefit. This has led to some African countries becoming heavily indebted to China, with China using debt as leverage to secure resource extraction and other economic interests. In response to these criticisms, China has sought to improve its image and relations with African countries through various initiatives, such as the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC, which aims to strengthen economic ties and promote cultural exchange between China and Africa. Additionally, some Chinese companies have committed to hiring more local labor and investing in social programs in the countries they operate in, to ensure that they are not viewed as exploitative. Overview of contemporary Chinese migration to Africa. Contemporary Chinese migration to Africa is a relatively recent phenomenon, with the majority of the migration taking place in the last 2 decades. The migration is mainly driven by economic reasons, with China seeking new markets and opportunities to invest in African countries, and African countries looking for partners to help them develop their economies. According to a report by the Migration Policy Institute, the number of Chinese migrants living in Africa increased from approximately 70,000 in 2000 to more than 1 million in 2019. The majority of these migrants are engaged in businesses such as trade, manufacturing, and construction. China has been investing heavily in African infrastructure, with projects such as the Standard Gauge Railway in Kenya and the Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railway in Ethiopia. These projects have been criticized for relying heavily on Chinese labor and materials, leading to concerns about the impact on local economies and job creation. The Chinese government has also been involved in supporting the migration of its citizens to Africa. In 2015, China launched a new initiative called One Belt, One Road, which seeks to promote economic cooperation between China and countries along the old Silk Road trade routes, including many African countries. The initiative has been criticized for potentially leading to debt traps and dependency on China, but it has also provided opportunities for Chinese companies and workers to expand their operations in Africa. The Chinese government has also established Confucius Institutes in several African countries, which provide language and cultural education to African students. Some critics argue that these institutes are used to promote Chinese influence in Africa and suppress dissenting views. The influx of Chinese migrants to Africa has not been without controversy. There have been reports of discrimination against African workers and businesses by Chinese migrants, as well as concerns about environmental degradation and labor abuses associated with Chinese-funded projects. In response to these concerns, some African governments have taken steps to regulate the activities of Chinese migrants in their countries. For example, in Zambia, the government has increased regulations on Chinese-owned businesses in response to allegations of labor abuses and environmental damage. Contemporary Chinese migration to Africa has been on the rise in recent decades, with a significant increase in Chinese people moving to the continent for various reasons. The migration is largely driven by economic interests, with China seeking to expand its economic influence in Africa. One of the main factors driving Chinese migration to Africa is the abundance of natural resources in the continent. China's rapid industrialization has led to a growing demand for natural resources such as oil, minerals, and timber, which Africa has in abundance. This has led to Chinese companies investing heavily in the extraction and exportation of these resources, which has in turn led to an influx of Chinese workers into Africa. Another factor driving Chinese migration to Africa is the increasing trade relations between the two regions. China has become Africa's largest trading partner, with trade between the two regions growing rapidly in recent years. This has led to an increase in Chinese businesses and entrepreneurs setting up shop in Africa to take advantage of the growing market opportunities. Chinese migration to Africa has also been driven by the Chinese government's strategic interests in the region. China has been seeking to expand its geopolitical influence in Africa by strengthening its economic ties with the continent. As a result, the Chinese government has been providing significant financial assistance and investment to African countries, which has in turn led to an increase in the number of Chinese people living and working in Africa. In terms of the demographics of contemporary Chinese migrants to Africa, the majority are young and highly educated individuals, primarily from urban areas in China. Many of them are skilled professionals, such as engineers, doctors, and business executives, who are drawn to Africa by the opportunities for career advancement and the chance to gain international experience. There is also a significant number of Chinese migrants to Africa who are involved in small-scale trade and business activities. These individuals typically operate in the informal sector, selling goods such as electronics, clothing, and household items in local markets and on the streets. In terms of the countries that are most popular destinations for Chinese migrants to Africa, South Africa is the most popular destination due to its relatively developed infrastructure and business environment. Other popular destinations include Nigeria, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Tanzania, which are seen as promising emerging markets with significant potential for economic growth. However, the increasing presence of Chinese migrants in Africa has also been met with some controversy and criticism. Some African countries have expressed concerns about the impact of Chinese migration on local economies, with some accusing Chinese businesses of engaging in exploitative practices and taking jobs away from local workers. There have also been reports of cultural clashes between Chinese migrants and local communities, with some locals expressing frustration with the perceived lack of cultural sensitivity and respect shown by Chinese migrants. Reasons and motivations for Chinese migration to Africa. In recent years, there has been a significant increase in Chinese migration to Africa, and this trend is expected to continue. There are several reasons and motivations for this migration, which are discussed below. Economic opportunities. China has been investing heavily in Africa in recent years, and this has created economic opportunities for Chinese businesses and individuals. China's investment in Africa has been focused on infrastructure development, mining, and agriculture, among other sectors. Chinese entrepreneurs and investors are attracted to Africa's growing consumer market, abundant natural resources, and low labor costs. Diplomacy. China's engagement with Africa is also motivated by diplomatic and political considerations. China has been working to strengthen its relationships with African countries, which it views as strategic partners. Chinese migration to Africa can serve as a means of deepening these relationships and enhancing China's influence in the region. Cultural exchange. Chinese migration to Africa can also facilitate cultural exchange between the two regions. Many Chinese migrants come to Africa to teach Chinese language and culture, or to study African languages and cultures. This can help to foster mutual understanding and appreciation between Chinese and African communities. Education. Chinese students are increasingly choosing to study in African universities, attracted by lower tuition fees and the opportunity to learn about a different culture. This has led to an increase in Chinese migration to Africa, particularly among students and academics. Personal reasons. Finally, many Chinese migrants come to Africa for personal reasons, such as to reunite with family members, to escape China's high cost of living, or to seek a new life and career opportunities. It is important to note that the motivations for Chinese migration to Africa are complex and multifaceted, and can vary depending on the individual. However, the factors mentioned above are some of the most common reasons cited by Chinese migrants and scholars. The reasons for Chinese migration to Africa are complex and multifaceted. Some of the key motivations behind Chinese migration to Africa include economic opportunities, strategic interests, and cultural ties. One of the primary reasons for Chinese migration to Africa is economic opportunities. China has become one of the largest investors in Africa in recent years, with many Chinese companies investing in sectors such as infrastructure, mining, and agriculture. These investments have created new opportunities for Chinese workers to find employment in Africa, particularly in areas where there are labor shortages. In addition to economic opportunities, Chinese migration to Africa is also driven by strategic interests. China is keen to establish a strong presence in Africa in order to secure access to the continent's natural resources, as well as to expand its geopolitical influence. As such, Chinese migrants in Africa often work in sectors that are of strategic importance to China, such as mining and infrastructure. Another factor that contributes to Chinese migration to Africa is cultural ties. China has a long history of engagement with Africa, and many Chinese migrants feel a sense of cultural affinity with the continent. In addition, many Chinese migrants in Africa are driven by a desire to learn more about African cultures and traditions, and to build closer ties with local communities. Economic and social impact of Chinese migration on Africa. Chinese migration to Africa has brought about both economic and social impacts, which have been felt in different ways across the continent. Here are some of the significant effects of Chinese migration on Africa. Economic impact. Investment. The Chinese migrants have brought in significant investments to Africa, which have contributed to the continent's economic development. China is now Africa's largest trading partner, with investments mainly in infrastructure, energy, and natural resources. Employment. The influx of Chinese migrants has created job opportunities for Africans, mainly in construction, manufacturing, and other industries. This has contributed to reducing the unemployment rate in some African countries. Technology transfer. Chinese migrants have brought in technological advancements that have positively impacted various sectors, including manufacturing, agriculture, and transportation. This has resulted in the creation of new industries and the modernization of existing ones. Market access. With Chinese investments in Africa, the continent now has better access to the Chinese market, which is one of the largest in the world. This has created more opportunities for African businesses to export their goods to China. Social impact. Cultural exchange. Chinese migration to Africa has led to cultural exchanges between the two regions, with Africans learning about Chinese culture, language, and traditions, while Chinese migrants learn about African cultures. Education. Chinese migrants have established educational institutions in Africa, providing quality education to African students. This has created more opportunities for Africans to acquire knowledge and skills that they can use to contribute to their country's development. Social integration: Chinese migrants have integrated into the local communities, and their presence has led to the creation of a multicultural society in some African countries. This has led to the promotion of tolerance, understanding, and respect for different cultures. Social tensions: the influx of Chinese migrants has also led to social tensions in some African countries. This is mainly due to the perception that Chinese migrants are taking away job opportunities from the locals, leading to resentment and sometimes hostility towards them. The economic and social impact of Chinese migration to Africa is a complex and often debated topic. While some argue that it has brought significant economic benefits to African countries, others argue that it has also led to social and economic problems. One of the primary economic benefits of Chinese migration to Africa is the influx of investment and infrastructure development. Chinese companies and investors have been involved in a wide range of projects in Africa, including building roads, railways, ports, and other infrastructure. These projects have helped to improve connectivity and trade within and between African countries, which in turn has led to increased economic growth. Additionally, Chinese migration has also brought new job opportunities to many Africans. Chinese businesses have been involved in a range of industries, including mining, agriculture, and manufacturing, and have created jobs for locals in these sectors. This has helped to reduce unemployment rates and improve the overall standard of living in many African countries. However, there are also concerns about the negative economic impact of Chinese migration to Africa. For example, some argue that Chinese businesses often bring their own workers from China rather than hiring locals, which can lead to a lack of job opportunities for Africans. Additionally, there are concerns that Chinese investment in Africa is primarily focused on extracting resources and exporting them back to China, rather than developing local industries and economies. The social impact of Chinese migration to Africa is also a matter of debate. Some argue that it has brought cultural diversity and exchange, while others argue that it has led to social tensions and conflict. One issue that has been raised is the perceived lack of integration between Chinese migrants and the local population. Chinese migrants often live in segregated communities and may not interact extensively with locals. This can lead to social tensions and misunderstandings, particularly when there are cultural and linguistic differences. There are also concerns about the impact of Chinese migration on local cultures and traditions. Some argue that Chinese businesses and migrants are contributing to the erosion of traditional African cultures, particularly through the adoption of Chinese language and cultural practices. Another social impact of Chinese migration to Africa is the issue of labor rights and working conditions. There have been reports of Chinese businesses exploiting their workers, including paying low wages and providing poor working conditions. This can lead to social tensions and conflict, particularly when local workers feel that they are being treated unfairly.